January 17, 1942, USS Enterprise, somewhere in the gray-green swells of the Central Pacific. The deck trembles. Salt spray mists the steel. A young ensign grips the throttle of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat, engine coughing in the cold dawn air. He is 22 years old. His hands are steady, but his breath fogs the canopy glass. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the curve of the world, an enemy waits. An enemy who has already proven itself in China, in Malaya, in the burning harbor of Pearl Harbor. The deck officer raises his flag. The engine roars. The Wildcat lurches forward, gaining speed, and then, airborne, a single fighter, trembling against the vastness of the sky. In Tokyo, in the officers' clubs of the Imperial Japanese Navy, they are laughing. Not with cruelty, but with certainty. They have seen the reports. They have read the intelligence summaries. American naval aviators, they say, are trained like factory workers, predictable, mechanical, lacking the warrior's spirit, the Bushido that has been honed over centuries. The Americans are wealthy, yes, but wealth does not translate to valor. The Americans are numerous, yes, but numbers do not replace the singular dedication of a pilot who has trained since boyhood to serve the emperor. In the wardrooms of the Akagi and the Kaga, over cups of warm sake, the verdict is unanimous. The U.S. Navy's carrier air groups are no match for the elite aviators of the Kido Butai. This is not arrogance. This is history. At least, that is what they believe. By the winter of 1941, the Japanese Naval Air Arm had established itself as the finest carrier-based aviation force in the world. Its pilots had been forged in the crucible of the Second Sino-Japanese War, flying over the cities and rivers of China, perfecting their craft under fire. The Zero, Mitsubishi's A6M, was faster, more maneuverable, and longer-ranged than any American fighter in the Pacific. The torpedo bomber crews had practiced their runs for months, skimming low over the waters of Kagoshima Bay, simulating the shallow harbor conditions they would face at Pearl Harbor. The dive bomber pilots could place a 250-kilogram bomb onto a moving target from 3,000 meters with terrifying accuracy. These were not amateurs. These were the finest warriors Japan could produce, and they knew it. The Americans, by contrast, appeared to be amateurs playing at war. That, at least, was the perception. Japanese intelligence officers reviewed captured training manuals and intercepted communications. What they found seemed to confirm their suspicions. U.S. Navy aviator training was methodical, yes, but also rigid. Pilots were drilled in formation, flying, in radio discipline, in navigation by instrument. They flew in straight lines. They followed procedures. They practiced gunnery runs against towed sleeves, dive bombing against stationary targets painted on the desert floor of California. There was no seishin, no spiritual fire. There was no improvisation, no instinctive understanding of the sky as a battlefield where only the bold survive. The Americans, the Japanese believed, had mistaken proficiency for excellence. And yet, there was something the Japanese did not see, something their intelligence officers could not quantify, could not translate into charts and graphs and threat assessments. The American training system was not designed to produce individual aces. It was designed to produce something far more dangerous. A machine. Not a machine in the derogatory sense, but in the sense of an interconnected system, vast and adaptable, capable of generating skilled aviators, not in dozens, but in thousands. While the Japanese trained their pilots in small, elite cohorts, each man a carefully cultivated weapon, the Americans were building an assembly line of competence. And in a war of attrition, competence at scale would prove more lethal than brilliance in scarcity. Consider the numbers. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had approximately 3,500 naval aviators. These men were the product of years of training, many of them veterans of combat operations over China. They were irreplaceable. The training pipeline could not produce more than a few hundred new pilots per year, and each loss was a permanent wound to the force. The United States, by contrast, entered the war with fewer experienced carrier pilots than Japan. But it had something Japan could never match: industrial capacity and an educational infrastructure capable of scaling up aviation training at exponential speed. By 1942, the U.S. Navy was graduating more than 1,000 new aviators every month. By 1943, that number had doubled. By 1944, the sky above the Pacific would be crowded with American wings. But in January 1942, none of this is yet apparent. The Japanese have just completed their stunning victory at Pearl Harbor. The American battleship fleet lies shattered in the mud of the harbor. Wake Island has fallen. Guam has fallen. The Philippines are under siege. Across the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun is ascending. Japanese pilots, flush with victory, speak openly of their contempt for American airmen. One pilot, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, writes in his diary, "The enemy flies like students reciting lessons. No fire, no soul." Another, in a letter home, describes the American pilots as mechanics who learn to fly. These are not insults born of hatred, but of genuine bewilderment. How could a nation of such wealth and power produce warriors so lacking in spirit? The answer, had they understood it, would have terrified them. The Americans were not training warriors. They were training professionals. And the difference, though subtle, would prove decisive. The U.S. Navy's Carrier Air Group training system was built on a foundation of standardization and redundancy. Every pilot learned the same procedures, the same maneuvers, the same radio calls. This was not rigidity. This was interoperability. An ensign from Pennsylvania could fly alongside a lieutenant from Texas and a commander from California. And all three would execute a dive-bombing attack with synchronized precision, because they had been trained to think not as individuals, but as parts of a whole. The Japanese prized the lone ace, the singular genius who could turn the tide of battle through sheer skill and daring. The Americans prized the formation, the coordinated strike, the massed firepower of dozens of aircraft arriving over the target at the same time, from different altitudes, overwhelming the enemy's ability to respond. And then there was the matter of aircraft. The Japanese Zero was a masterpiece of engineering. Light, agile, deadly in a dogfight. But it was also fragile. It lacked armor plating. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst from a heavy machine gun could send it spiraling in flames. The American fighters, first the Wildcat, then the Hellcat, then the Corsair, were built like tanks. They could absorb punishment that would have destroyed a Zero and still bring their pilots home. This was not by accident. The Americans had learned from the British, from the survivors of the Battle of Britain, that the most important thing in aviation warfare was not shooting down the enemy, but keeping your own pilots alive. A pilot who survived his first 10 missions would become exponentially more effective in his next 10. The Americans designed their aircraft and their training to maximize pilot survival. The Japanese designed theirs to maximize individual lethality. In the short term, the Japanese approach was devastating. In the long term, it was suicidal. February 1942. The USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown launch raids against Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands and New Guinea. The strikes are small, symbolic more than strategic, but they are the first American carrier offensive operations of the war. Japanese pilots intercept the American formations and are stunned. These are not the hesitant mechanical flyers they expected. The American dive bombers come in steep and fast. Their attacks coordinated with fighter cover that does not break formation even under fire. The torpedo bombers press their runs despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, their discipline unshaken. And the fighters, those lumbering wildcats that should be easy prey for the nimble Zero, refuse to engage in turning dogfights. Instead, they use slashing attacks, diving from altitude, firing a burst, then climbing away before the Zeros can react. It is a tactic called boom and zoom, and it negates the Zero's maneuverability advantage. The Japanese pilots report back with something new in their voices: uncertainty. But it is in May 1942, in the Coral Sea, that the first great test arrives. Two American carriers face off against two Japanese carriers in the first naval battle in history, where the opposing fleets never sight each other. Everything depends on the aviators. The Japanese expect an easy victory. Their pilots have months of combat experience. Their aircraft are superior. Their tactics are proven. And yet, when the strike groups meet in the skies above the Solomon Sea, the Americans do not collapse. They fight with a stubborn, grinding effectiveness that frustrates every Japanese expectation. The USS Lexington is sunk, yes, but the Japanese lose the light carrier, Tsaur, Shoho, and the Shokaku is so badly damaged that it will be out of action for months. More importantly, the Japanese lose pilots, veteran pilots, irreplaceable pilots, pilots who cannot be replaced by the slow, inadequate training system back home. 1 month later, at Midway, the illusion shatters completely. The Japanese bring 4 fleet carriers, the heart of their naval air power, the same ships that struck Pearl Harbor. The Americans bring 3, one of them hastily repaired and barely operational. On paper, the Japanese should win. In practice, they are annihilated. 4 Japanese carriers are sunk in a single day. Over 300 aircraft are destroyed. More than 100 pilots are killed. And the American carrier air groups, those mechanics who learn to fly, prove themselves capable of coordinated, devastating strikes that exploit every tactical opportunity. The dive bombers of USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown arrive over the Japanese fleet at the exact moment when the enemy carriers are rearming their aircraft, their decks crowded with fueled and armed planes. The result is catastrophic. One bomb, then another, each striking with the precision that only comes from hundreds of hours of practice, of repetition, of the very mechanical training the Japanese had mocked. The Japanese pilots who survived Midway return to their ships in a state of shock. They do not understand what happened. They had fought well. They had been brave. They had followed their training. And yet they had been defeated, not by superior individual skill, but by superior coordination, superior numbers, superior industrial support. One Japanese pilot, floating in a life raft waiting for rescue, watches the American carriers steam away over the horizon and realizes, with a sinking dread, that this war will not be won by courage alone. But the transformation is not complete. The Americans have won at Midway, yes, but they are still learning. In the months that follow over Guadalcanal, the carrier air groups are tested again and again. The Japanese still have veteran pilots, still have the Zero, still have the tactical experience. And in the close, chaotic air battles over the Solomon Islands, that experience tells. The Americans lose planes, they lose pilots. But unlike the Japanese, they can replace them. Every month, new squadrons arrive from the training bases in California and Florida. Fresh pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time, trained in the latest tactics, eager and competent. The Japanese, by contrast, are burning through their irreplaceable veterans. Each loss is permanent. Each death is a wound that cannot heal. By 1943, the imbalance is undeniable. The U.S. Navy commissions the Essex-class fleet carriers, huge ships capable of carrying more than 100 aircraft each. The new Grumman F-6F Hellcat arrives in the Pacific, a fighter designed specifically to kill Zeros. Faster, tougher, more heavily armed. And the pilots flying these new planes are no longer the green ensigns of 1942. They are experienced, blooded, confident. The training system has refined itself, incorporating lessons from every battle, every engagement. Pilots are taught not just to fly, but to survive. They learn energy tactics, gunnery deflection shooting, how to coordinate with their wingmen, how to manage their fuel and ammunition, how to navigate back to the carrier in the dark. The Japanese still train individual warriors. The Americans train teams. The turning point, if it can be called that, comes in the summer of 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese launch a massive strike, 400 aircraft, against the American carrier task force. It is their last great throw of the dice, an attempt to destroy the American fleet and turn the tide of the war. The Americans meet them with a wall of Hellcats. What follows is a slaughter so one-sided that American pilots will later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, the Japanese lose more than 300 aircraft and their pilots. The Americans lose fewer than 30. It is not a battle. It is an execution. And the reason is simple. The Americans have perfected the art of carrier aviation warfare. Their pilots are trained to fight as a coordinated force, supported by radar, directed by fighter controllers, flying aircraft that are tougher and more powerful than anything the Japanese can field. The Japanese pilots, brave as they are flying into a killing machine. One American pilot, after landing on the USS Lexington that evening, sits in his cockpit and does not move. He has shot down 6 planes. He is 23 years old. He thinks about the Japanese pilots he killed, and he wonders if they knew, in those final seconds, that they had been sent to die by a command structure that could no longer adapt, could no longer compete, could no longer produce the trained aviators necessary to fight a modern war. He does not gloat. He does not celebrate. He simply feels tired. The symbolic object, the thread that runs through this entire transformation, is not a weapon. It is not a plane. It is the training syllabus, a binder full of paper, mimeographed pages, checklists and procedures and lesson plans. To the Japanese, such a document would seem lifeless, bureaucratic, unworthy of a warrior. But that syllabus is the weapon that won the Pacific Air War. It is the embodiment of American industrial might, the ability to take a farm boy from Iowa or a mechanic from Detroit and, in 18 months, turn him into a competent carrier aviator. The syllabus does not produce legends. It produces results. And in war, results are all that matter. By 1945, the transformation is complete. The U.S. Navy's carrier air groups are the most powerful aerial force in the world. They operate with a scale and efficiency that the Japanese can no longer contest. The skies above Japan are filled with American wings, Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, Helldivers, flying from a fleet of carriers so numerous that they darken the sea. The Japanese, meanwhile, have resorted to kamikaze attacks, throwing away their remaining pilots in suicidal dives because they no longer have the trained aviators or the industrial capacity to fight any other way. It is a final, desperate admission. We cannot compete with your system. We cannot match your training. We cannot replace our losses. All we can do is die with honor. And the Americans, those pilots who were once mocked as mechanics, as factory workers, as soulless technicians, they fly on. They do not mock their enemy. They do not gloat. They simply do their job, because that is what they were trained to do. They fly their missions, they drop their bombs, they strafe their targets, and they return to their carriers. They eat hot meals in the ready room. They sleep in bunks with clean sheets. They write letters home, and the next morning, they do it again. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a Japanese pilot who was captured late in the war. He was asked, through a translator, what had surprised him most about the American pilots. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "They were never hungry." It is a small detail, but it contains a universe of meaning. The Americans were never hungry because their supply lines were intact, their logistics were overwhelming, their industrial base was untouchable. But more than that, they were never spiritually hungry. They did not need the fervor of Bushido or the cult of the warrior to motivate them. They fought because they were trained to fight, because they were part of a system that supported them, that valued their lives, that brought them home when it could, and mourned them when it could not. The Japanese had trained their pilots to die. The Americans had trained theirs to win, and in the end, that made all the difference. The epilogue of this story is not written in fire or blood, but in quiet classrooms in Pensacola and Corpus Christi, where the training continues. The young men who walk those halls do not know that they are part of a machine, a vast industrial and educational system that can produce competence at a scale never before seen in human history. They only know that they want to fly. They want to serve. They want to be part of something larger than themselves. And the system, cold and bureaucratic and utterly effective, takes them in and transforms them, not into warriors, but into professionals, not into legends, but into pilots. The Japanese had mocked the U.S. Navy's carrier air groups because they did not understand what they were looking at. They saw rigidity and mistook it for weakness. They saw standardization and mistook it for mediocrity. They saw a system and mistook it for the absence of spirit. But the system was the spirit. The system was the embodiment of a democratic nation's ability to mobilize its resources, to educate its citizens, to turn ordinary men into extraordinary capabilities through training, discipline, and industrial support. The Japanese believed in the supremacy of the individual warrior. The Americans believed in the supremacy of the collective effort. And in the vast industrial crucible of the Pacific War, the collective effort proved unstoppable. There is a photograph, taken in August 1945, of the deck of the USS Missouri. The war is over. The surrender has been signed. In the background, hundreds of carrier aircraft fly overhead in formation. A final demonstration of American air power. They fly in perfect lines, perfect intervals, perfect coordination. It is not a display of individual brilliance. It is a display of system, of training, of the unromantic but undeniable power of doing things correctly, at scale, again and again, until victory becomes inevitable. The Japanese pilots who had mocked those formations in 1941 are gone. Most of them died in the cockpits of their Zeros, falling into the sea or exploding in mid-air, victims of a training system that could not replace them and a tactical doctrine that valued their deaths more than their lives. The Americans who fly overhead in 1945 are not the same men who flew in 1942, but they are products of the same system, and that system has not only survived, it has triumphed. In the end, the sky does not belong to the brave. It does not belong to the skilled. It does not belong to the warriors. It belongs to those who can train their pilots faster than the enemy can kill them, who can build their planes faster than the enemy can destroy them, who can adapt their tactics faster than the enemy can respond. The sky belongs to the system. And in the Pacific, from 1942 to 1945, the system wore American wings. The great irony is that the Japanese were not wrong to mock the early American carrier pilots. In 1941, they were inferior. But they were inferior in a way that could be corrected. The Americans had the capacity to learn, to adapt, to improve. The Japanese, locked into their reverence for the individual warrior and their slow, artisanal approach to pilot training, did not. And so the pilots who were mocked became the pilots who dominated, not through any inherent superiority, but through the unglamorous, relentless application of industrial-age training methods to the ancient art of aerial combat. This is the story of how a democracy at war discovered that its greatest strength was not its heroes, but its ability to produce competent professionals in unlimited numbers. It is the story of how a mimeographed training syllabus became more deadly than any samurai sword. It is the story of how the skies above the Pacific, once ruled by the finest aviators Japan could produce, became an American domain. Not through brilliance, but through persistence. Not through spirit, but through system. Not through warriors, but through professionals who did their jobs, survived when they could, and were replaced when they could not. And in that transformation, in that shift from individual excellence to collective competence, lies a truth about modern warfare that the Japanese learned too late. In a total war, The nation that can train its citizens fastest will dominate the nation that trains its warriors best. The sky does not care about honor. It does not care about tradition. It only cares about results. And in the Pacific, from Midway to Okinawa, the results spoke for themselves. The American carrier air groups did not win because they were better warriors. They won because they were part of a better system. And that system, built on democratic ideals of education, standardization, and mass production, proved more powerful than any code of Bushido. The Japanese had mocked the mechanics who learned to fly. By 1945, those mechanics owned the sky.